He served 4 tours overseas, led hundreds of men into battle, and earned the nation's highest military honors, but nothing prepared him for the war waiting in his own backyard. When a retired U.S. Army general refused to bow down to a corrupt HOA and their self-appointed police, he sparked a revolution in a quiet American suburb. What started with a flagpole turned into a neighborhood uprising, and a battle for the soul of a community. You won't believe what happened when he stood his ground, and the cameras started rolling. If you believe no veteran should be bullied in the country they fought for, share this story. Stand with the ones who stand for us. Subscribe for more real-life stories of courage, justice, and fighting back the right way. General Marcus Hayes had seen things most men wouldn't dare imagine. For over 3 decades, he had served the United States Army with unwavering dedication. From the scorched sands of Iraq to the treacherous mountains of Afghanistan, he had led his troops with honor, courage, and unshakable discipline. He had commanded soldiers in active war zones, diffused high-risk insurgencies, and earned a reputation as the man who never flinched under fire. His chest bore medals of valor and sacrifice, and his name carried weight in military circles. But after 32 years, the time had come to step away from the battlefield. He chose a quiet, tree-lined suburb in Northern Virginia to retire, a peaceful place with pristine lawns, 2-car garages, and chirping birds. A neighborhood where no one raised their voice, and everyone waved at one another. He bought a modest 2-story brick home on a corner lot, one that offered space for his trusted German Shepherd, Ranger, and room to breathe. Marcus wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for peace. The first week after moving in, he made small improvements to the house. Not flashy things, just practical. He installed security cameras at the front and back, not because he feared crime, but because caution had been his companion for years. A flagpole was next. 12 feet tall, centered on his front lawn, where he raised the stars and stripes every morning at dawn and lowered it respectfully each evening. For Marcus, the flag wasn't decoration. It was sacred. He had folded it over caskets, carried it through sandstorms, and saluted it under enemy fire. Flying it high in his front yard was not a choice, it was a duty. Most neighbors greeted him kindly at first. They admired his military background, waved as he walked Ranger, and thanked him for his service. But not everyone saw him with respect. Within 10 days, he received a letter on crisp white paper, stamped with the emblem of the Homeowners Association. It stated that his flagpole violated the neighborhood's uniform aesthetics policy. The message was courteous but firm. The pole had to come down within 5 days or he'd face a fine of $100 per day. Marcus didn't react with anger. Instead, he reviewed the HOA bylaws carefully. There was no mention of flagpole height restrictions. Nothing in the rules prohibited the flying of the American flag. Still, he replied politely, explaining that the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005 protected his right to fly it on his property. He assumed the matter would be dropped. But it wasn't. Next came a complaint about his security cameras. The HOA claimed they were intrusive and disturbed the visual harmony of the neighborhood. Another fine was threatened. Then came another letter. Rangers barking during the day had disrupted the peace. Marcus was stunned. Ranger only barked when someone came too close to the property, usually delivery drivers or passing dogs. Nothing out of the ordinary. He began to notice something unsettling. While other homes had lawn signs, decorative flags, or even barking dogs, none of them seemed to be receiving citations. Only him. The HOA president, a sharp-jawed man named Cliff Maddox, had stopped by once for a welcome visit. Maddox had smiled stiffly, praised Marcus's record, and then warned him, "This neighborhood values order. We run a tight ship around here." Marcus had heard that tone before, in dictatorships he'd helped topple overseas. He wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions. But the pattern was becoming hard to ignore. The letters became more frequent. The fines more aggressive. A warning appeared next: his front lawn's grass was allegedly half an inch too high. He measured it himself. It wasn't. Still, a $50 notice showed up the next day. Marcus began to wonder whether the HOA had a personal agenda. Was it about control? Was it about him being a military man who didn't bow easily to authority? Or was there something deeper, something uglier, about the way they targeted him and no one else? He didn't want conflict. He had fought enough battles to last a lifetime. But being bullied in his own home was something he wouldn't tolerate. He paid his dues, obeyed the law, and upheld the Constitution with his life. Being told his flagpole was offensive felt like a slap in the face. He decided to keep records, every letter, every photograph, every interaction. He bought a voice recorder, logged phone calls, and stored video footage on an encrypted drive. If this was going to continue, he wouldn't fight with fists or fury. He'd fight with facts. Little did he know, the real storm hadn't even begun. What started as a few letters from the HOA was about to turn into the most personal war he'd ever fought, not on foreign soil, but right at home. In most neighborhoods, homeowners associations were formed to keep things tidy and organized, to ensure that lawns stayed neat, fences matched, and no one painted their house neon green. But in this neighborhood, the HOA had evolved into something far more aggressive. Under the leadership of Cliff Maddox, it had become less of a maintenance group and more of an unofficial regime. Cliff wasn't just the HOA president, he was a man who thrived on control. A former corporate compliance officer, he brought a cold, bureaucratic ruthlessness to the job. Rules were his currency. Power was his fuel. While some board members quietly disagreed with his methods, they rarely voiced opposition. Cliff ran meetings like a courtroom, silencing dissent and manipulating votes with calculated precision. He often quoted policy like scripture and claimed that personal preferences must never come before community standards. Under his rule, the HOA began issuing warnings for increasingly trivial matters: a basketball hoop left out after dusk, a wreath hung before the official start of the holiday season, a garden gnome deemed too whimsical. But Marcus Hayes represented a different kind of threat, one that Cliff hadn't encountered before. A man who followed rules, but refused to be intimidated by them. Cliff's frustration grew when Marcus didn't cave under pressure. Instead of complying with the removal of his flagpole, Marcus calmly cited federal law. Instead of reacting emotionally to fines, he documented everything. Cliff saw this not as defiance, but as challenge. And challenges, in his mind, needed to be crushed. So the HOA evolved once again, this time into enforcement. They introduced a new initiative under the guise of Neighborhood Safety and Standards. It was called the Community Compliance Patrol, but everyone quickly started calling them what they looked like: the HOA Police. Volunteers were recruited, vests and laminated ID cards were handed out, and patrol schedules were drawn. These weren't just clipboard-holding inspectors. They wore body cams, issued warnings on the spot, and took photos of violations to file in digital records. Cliff justified the program as a way to proactively maintain order and prevent deterioration of neighborhood standards. But for many residents, it felt more like surveillance. Some neighbors quietly expressed concern. Others feared that speaking up would make them targets. A few even moved out, quietly selling their homes and citing excessive restrictions in their departure notices. The HOA police took a particular interest in Marcus. His property was visited more than any other. Photos were taken of his shrub trimming, his recycling bin placement, even the distance between his driveway and the sidewalk chalk his neighbors' children occasionally drew. One officer once cited him for leaving his trash bins at the curb 4 minutes past the posted time. It was relentless. But Marcus remained composed. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply gathered more documentation, cataloged every incident, and made copies of every citation. His military discipline kicked in. He viewed each action not as a personal insult, but as evidence. Things escalated when a formal warning was issued over the sound of ranger barking. The HOA police claimed there had been multiple complaints of noise disturbances, despite ranger barking only when approached. Marcus requested proof. None was provided. Instead, the next warning came with a printed page listing possible penalties for ongoing neighborhood disruptions, including the potential for legal action. Marcus couldn't ignore the deeper pattern. The HOA police rarely visited other homes more than once a week. But his house was being watched daily. A few neighbors began whispering that Cliff had an issue with veterans. Others pointed out that Marcus was the only black homeowner on his block. Whether it was bias, ego, or pure abuse of power, something was driving Cliff to escalate. The most troubling sign came when Marcus received a formal citation accusing him of unauthorized surveillance. The HOA claimed that his security cameras, though facing only his own property, created an atmosphere of discomfort for passers-by. It was a stretch, legally and logically. But it hinted at a new strategy, an attempt to disarm Marcus not physically, but digitally. Remove the cameras, and they could control the narrative. Marcus declined, again citing his rights under state law. The HOA responded with another fine and a compliance deadline. The message was clear: bend or break. Behind the scenes, Cliff began telling other board members that Marcus was uncooperative, confrontational, and undermining community cohesion. He even suggested that Marcus's presence and unwillingness to comply were creating division in the neighborhood. Some board members nodded silently. Others looked uncomfortable but stayed quiet. Marcus wasn't blind to any of it. He could feel the shift, the way certain neighbors now avoided eye contact, the sudden coldness from people who once smiled. But he also knew something Cliff didn't. He understood how oppressive systems operated. He had seen them before, in faraway lands where fear was used to keep people silent and where those in power believed they were untouchable. He wasn't about to let it happen in his own backyard. The pressure campaign against Marcus Hayes didn't stop, it intensified. With each refusal to comply, each law Marcus cited in response, the HOA became more emboldened in its tactics. It was no longer about flagpoles or barking dogs. It had become a targeted campaign designed to break his will or force him out. The fines increased. Letters arrived twice a week now, citing obscure or exaggerated violations. His mailbox overflowed with notices, most of them carbon copies of earlier warnings, but each carrying slightly harsher language. Final warning turned into escalated enforcement, and enforcement became legal consideration. The HOA stopped pretending it was a neutral body. Cliff Maddox's signature was on nearly every document. Then came the drone. It started one Saturday afternoon. A soft buzzing could be heard outside Marcus's home. At first, he thought it was kids playing with a toy. But when the buzzing returned the next morning, hovering directly above his backyard, it became clear this wasn't a game. The drone circled over his garage, angled toward his windows, and dipped low enough to record footage of his fenced-in yard. No one had asked permission. No one had given a warning. Marcus filed a police report for unauthorized surveillance, but the local department said it was a civil matter, deferring to HOA jurisdiction. That same week, he received a citation from the HOA for outdoor clutter, based on photographs taken from the drone, images that showed a garden hose coiled next to a shed and a small collection of tools neatly stacked near his patio. It was a clear violation of privacy. Marcus requested an immediate HOA hearing to contest the citation. His request was ignored. 2 days later, a letter arrived with a threat: the HOA would begin the lien process against his home if unpaid fines exceeded $2,000. Marcus did the math. Between the flagpole, the security cameras, the barking dog, the surveillance allegations, and the newly added clutter fines, the total had ballooned to $2,150. The HOA was now threatening to seize a decorated Army general's home over citations they themselves created through targeted harassment. Neighbors began to take sides. A few brave ones knocked on Marcus's door to express support. They quietly admitted they'd been warned by Cliff not to get involved. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Keegan, admitted that her garden flag had been sighted just after she was seen chatting with Marcus during a morning walk. Another, a middle-aged father of 3, said Cliff had personally warned him that sympathizers could also be penalized for encouraging noncompliance. Word began to spread beyond the subdivision. A local veterans group caught wind of what was happening. A member who had served under Marcus years ago sent an email asking if the rumors were true. Marcus confirmed them briefly, saying only, "It's about more than me now." That message made its way through veteran networks. Stories of HOA abuse weren't new, but this one was different. This wasn't a dispute over lawn ornaments. It was about respect. Dignity. The treatment of someone who had given his entire life to the country, now being bullied on his own soil by a petty tyrant and his clipboard army. The drone returned a third time. This time, Marcus followed it with binoculars until he saw it land behind Cliff Maddox's house. That evidence, along with time-stamped footage from his own security system, was added to the file Marcus was building, a file now spanning over 100 pages of violations, photographs, letters, and legal references. The final spark came when a public notice was taped to Marcus's front door, visible to all passing cars. It stated that his property was in serious violation of community ethics and warned of potential foreclosure action. It was humiliating, bold, and illegal. The sign wasn't just a notice. It was a message. Marcus took it down calmly, but inside, something shifted. The HOA had crossed a line. Not just a legal boundary, but a moral one. They were trying to strip away his peace, his privacy, his rights, and now his home. He had followed every protocol. He had filed his paperwork. He had been patient, courteous, and firm. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was war by paper, a war they didn't expect him to fight back with the same tenacity he'd once used to outmaneuver foreign insurgents. Cliff Maddox didn't know it yet, but he had awakened something far more dangerous than neighborhood noncompliance. He had awakened the strategist inside a man who once planned military operations with lives at stake. Marcus wasn't just documenting anymore. He was building a case. And the battlefield was about to move from his front yard to the courtroom. Marcus Hayes had spent a lifetime leading with restraint and honor. He believed in protocols, in processes, in the power of quiet strength. But after months of surveillance, threats, and fabricated fines, silence was no longer an option. The line between patience and complicity had been crossed. The next step was not defense, it was exposure. The decision began with a letter. Marcus drafted a detailed, measured statement outlining his experience with the HOA. He included dates, citations, and references to federal and state laws that had been violated. He attached drone photographs, HOA notices, and even correspondence where he had attempted peaceful resolution. But instead of sending it to the HOA, he sent it to a local journalist who specialized in housing issues and civil disputes. Her name was Shelby Carr, and within hours of reading the documents, she called Marcus and said, "This story isn't just about you. It's about every American who's ever been bullied behind closed gates." The first article ran under the headline, "Decorated U.S. General Faces HOA Harassment in His Own Home." It quickly gained traction. Local news stations reached out. Veteran advocacy groups reposted the article with hashtags like #StandWithMarcus and #VeteransDeserveBetter. Social media lit up. People shared their own HOA horror stories, but the story of a black retired general being fined for flying the American flag struck a different nerve. Within 72 hours, the story reached national platforms. News anchors recounted how Marcus Hayes, a former brigadier general with honors from 3 administrations, was being threatened with home foreclosure over so-called aesthetic violations and surveillance discomfort. Interviews were requested. Talk shows called. Marcus chose his words carefully, never making it personal against any one member of the HOA, but consistently pointing out the systemic abuse of power hidden in suburban bylaws. The pressure mounted. Cliff Maddox, once untouchable within his HOA kingdom, suddenly found himself dodging reporters. When approached for comment, he dismissed the media coverage as sensationalism and misinformation. But it was too late. Screenshots of his old statements, emails signed in his name, and drone usage evidence had already been shared online. The more he denied, the more the truth found new paths to light. Veteran organizations rallied behind Marcus. The American Legion and VFW chapters issued statements of support. Congressional representatives, both Republican and Democrat, posted on social media, calling the treatment of Marcus unacceptable, un-American, and a disgrace. One congresswoman even introduced a draft bill aimed at curbing the unchecked power of HOAs to fine homeowners without judicial oversight. It was nicknamed the Hayes Act. Within the neighborhood, things shifted dramatically. Homes that once displayed polite silence now hung small flags in quiet solidarity. Some neighbors, previously too afraid to speak out, began forwarding Marcus copies of their own HOA violations, many of which had been dismissed without enforcement. One woman discovered her own complaint against Cliff had been quietly buried months earlier. More residents attended HOA meetings, demanding transparency. A petition began circulating to remove Cliff as president. Over half the neighborhood signed within 5 days. Board members who once supported Cliff now distanced themselves, claiming they had never approved the drone usage or supported the threat of foreclosure. The board called an emergency meeting to conduct damage control. But Marcus didn't attend. Instead, he was preparing legal filings with the help of pro bono attorneys from a civil rights law center. The goal wasn't just to stop the harassment, it was to set a legal precedent that no homeowner could be stripped of rights under the cover of neighborhood regulations. Public interest peaked when Marcus testified via video call during a local government hearing on HOA reform. With calm authority, he explained how systems of unchecked control often begin with good intentions and devolve into personal fiefdoms. He spoke not just of his own experience, but of the countless others who lacked the platform or privilege to speak. His message was simple: American freedom should not end at the gated entrance of a suburban community. National figures began weighing in. A former Secretary of Defense praised Marcus's courage, calling him a symbol of modern-day service. A retired Supreme Court justice publicly urged states to revisit HOA statutes that infringe on basic civil liberties. Celebrities tweeted support. A crowdfunding campaign launched by a veteran's spouse raised over $200,000 in 3 days, not because Marcus needed the money, but because people wanted to show that his fight mattered. Through it all, Marcus remained focused. His goal was not vengeance. It was accountability. He knew the country needed a conversation about how ordinary citizens could be stripped of dignity through bureaucracy. About how race, authority, and silence often combine to build walls thicker than any fence. Cliff Maddox, once the king of his cul-de-sac, now found himself under formal investigation by the state HOA Oversight Committee. Allegations of racial targeting, misuse of funds, and privacy violations mounted. His leadership was no longer seen as firm, it was seen as dangerous. Marcus had started this battle alone. But now, the nation stood with him. And Cliff, once so sure of his power, finally felt what it meant to be truly challenged, not by rage or rebellion, but by truth. Marcus Hayes had spent a lifetime leading with restraint and honor. He believed in protocols, in processes, in the power of quiet strength. But after months of surveillance, threats, and fabricated fines, silence was no longer an option. The line between patience and complicity had been crossed. The next step was not defense, it was exposure. The decision began with a letter. Marcus drafted a detailed, measured statement outlining his experience with the HOA. He included dates, citations, and references to federal and state laws that had been violated. He attached drone photographs, HOA notices, and even correspondence where he had attempted peaceful resolution. But instead of sending it to the HOA, he sent it to a local journalist who specialized in housing issues and civil disputes. Her name was Shelby Carr, and within hours of reading the documents, she called Marcus and said, "This story isn't just about you. It's about every American who's ever been bullied behind closed gates." The first article ran under the headline, "Decorated U.S. General Faces HOA Harassment in His Own Home." It quickly gained traction. Local news stations reached out. Veteran advocacy groups reposted the article with hashtags like #StandWithMarcus and #VeteransDeserveBetter. Social media lit up. People shared their own HOA horror stories, but the story of a black retired general being fined for flying the American flag struck a different nerve. Within 72 hours, the story reached national platforms. News anchors recounted how Marcus Hayes, a former brigadier general with honors from 3 administrations, was being threatened with home foreclosure over so-called aesthetic violations and surveillance discomfort. Interviews were requested. Talk shows called. Marcus chose his words carefully, never making it personal against any one member of the HOA, but consistently pointing out the systemic abuse of power hidden in suburban bylaws. The pressure mounted. Cliff Maddox, once untouchable within his HOA kingdom, suddenly found himself dodging reporters. When approached for comment, he dismissed the media coverage as sensationalism and misinformation. But it was too late. Screenshots of his old statements, emails signed in his name, and drone usage evidence had already been shared online. The more he denied, the more the truth found new paths to light. Veteran organizations rallied behind Marcus. The American Legion and VFW chapters issued statements of support. Congressional representatives, both Republican and Democrat, posted on social media, calling the treatment of Marcus unacceptable, un-American, and a disgrace. One congresswoman even introduced a draft bill aimed at curbing the unchecked power of HOAs to fine homeowners without judicial oversight. It was nicknamed the Hayes Act. Within the neighborhood, things shifted dramatically. Homes that once displayed polite silence now hung small flags in quiet solidarity. Some neighbors, previously too afraid to speak out, began forwarding Marcus copies of their own HOA violations, many of which had been dismissed without enforcement. One woman discovered her own complaint against Cliff had been quietly buried months earlier. More residents attended HOA meetings, demanding transparency. A petition began circulating to remove Cliff as president. Over half the neighborhood signed within 5 days. Board members who once supported Cliff now distanced themselves, claiming they had never approved the drone usage or supported the threat of foreclosure. The board called an emergency meeting to conduct damage control. But Marcus didn't attend. Instead, he was preparing legal filings with the help of pro bono attorneys from a civil rights law center. The goal wasn't just to stop the harassment, it was to set a legal precedent that no homeowner could be stripped of rights under the cover of neighborhood regulations. Public interest peaked when Marcus testified via video call during a local government hearing on HOA reform. With calm authority, he explained how systems of unchecked control often begin with good intentions and devolve into personal fiefdoms. He spoke not just of his own experience, but of the countless others who lacked the platform or privilege to speak. His message was simple: American freedom should not end at the gated entrance of a suburban community. National figures began weighing in. A former Secretary of Defense praised Marcus's courage, calling him a symbol of modern-day service. A retired Supreme Court justice publicly urged states to revisit HOA statutes that infringe on basic civil liberties. Celebrities tweeted support. A crowdfunding campaign launched by a veteran's spouse raised over $200,000 in 3 days, not because Marcus needed the money, but because people wanted to show that his fight mattered. Through it all, Marcus remained focused. His goal was not vengeance. It was accountability. He knew the country needed a conversation about how ordinary citizens could be stripped of dignity through bureaucracy. About how race, authority, and silence often combine to build walls thicker than any fence. Cliff Maddox, once the king of his cul-de-sac, now found himself under formal investigation by the State HOA Oversight Committee. Allegations of racial targeting, misuse of funds, and privacy violations mounted. His leadership was no longer seen as firm, it was seen as dangerous. Marcus had started this battle alone. But now, the nation stood with him. And Cliff, once so sure of his power, finally felt what it meant to be truly challenged, not by rage or rebellion, but by truth. The legal battle entered full motion as Marcus Hayes filed a civil lawsuit against the HOA, naming Cliff Maddox and 3 other board members in their personal capacities. The charges included harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, racial discrimination, unlawful surveillance, and abuse of power under civil housing statutes. With media attention still high, the case was fast-tracked to a public court hearing. For the first time, the quiet power plays of a suburban HOA would be scrutinized under the eyes of the law and the nation. In the months leading up to the trial, more residents came forward to testify. Some admitted they had been coerced into silence, others revealed years of arbitrary citations and intimidation. Internal HOA emails, subpoenaed by Marcus's legal team, exposed a pattern of selective enforcement. In one message, Cliff had written, "We need to set an example with Hayes. Can't have him thinking he's above the rules just because he wore a uniform." Another board member responded, "We'll drown him in paperwork." The drone footage, financial records, and HOA meeting transcripts painted a picture of organized misconduct. It wasn't simply about a dispute over a flagpole or security cameras, it was about a systemic attempt to isolate, control, and expel a homeowner who dared challenge the board's authority. Race was not always stated, but it was often implied. "He's not like the rest of us," one note read. That line, when read aloud in court, became a national soundbite. Marcus's lawyers presented the case with precision, connecting every citation, letter, and drone flyover to a broader strategy of targeted harassment. They emphasized how the HOA's own charter had been violated repeatedly by its own leadership. They showed how Cliff had overridden internal votes, manipulated record-keeping, and approved enforcement measures without quorum. It was no longer just an ethics question, it was a legal reckoning. The defense, led by HOA counsel, argued that Marcus had violated community standards and refused to comply with bylaws. They downplayed the drone activity as security protocol and claimed the fines were routine. But under cross-examination, their argument began to collapse. No other resident had been fined for the same types of violations. No drone surveillance had ever occurred before Marcus moved in. The foreclosure threat had been issued after Marcus had filed complaints, not before. As the proceedings unfolded, the courtroom gallery filled with veterans, activists, and residents from neighborhoods across the state. The trial had become more than one man's fight, it was now a litmus test for the unchecked authority of private neighborhood governments. What began in a quiet cul-de-sac had erupted into a national conversation about property rights, discrimination, and the cost of silence. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours. Their verdict was unanimous. The HOA and its named board members were found guilty of intentional harassment, unlawful surveillance, and violation of civil housing protections. Damages were awarded in the amount of $2.5 million, including $1 million in punitive damages to send a message about systemic abuse of power. More importantly, the court issued a permanent injunction restricting the HOA from issuing further fines without external review, and requiring the immediate removal of Cliff Maddox from all HOA positions. The moment the verdict was announced, news outlets broadcast it live. Headlines across the country read, "General Hayes wins, HOA found guilty in landmark harassment case." Legal analysts called it a precedent-setting victory. Civil rights attorneys began reviewing similar cases in their states. State legislators introduced new bills to increase transparency and accountability within HOA boards. Some even proposed mandatory third-party audits for communities with a history of abuse. Cliff Maddox, once smug in his certainty, faced disbarment from future leadership roles and a separate criminal inquiry regarding financial misconduct uncovered during discovery. His reputation, once feared in his gated kingdom, had collapsed in spectacular fashion. He sold his home 6 months later and disappeared from public life. For Marcus, the victory was never about the money. He donated a large portion of the settlement to a legal defense fund for veterans facing housing discrimination. He worked with lawmakers to shape what became known as the HOA Accountability Reform Act, which mandated oversight boards and prohibited anonymous complaints and drone surveillance in private neighborhoods. He turned his painful experience into purpose. Across the country, homeowners who had once felt powerless began to organize. New neighborhood councils were formed. Reform candidates replaced long-standing HOA boards. Training programs were created to teach residents their rights. Marcus's case had not just exposed one abusive HOA, it had become a catalyst for a national movement. In his quiet community, things changed as well. The flags that had once been silent symbols of protest remained on porches long after the trial ended. Neighbors who once passed each other with polite nods now stopped to talk, to ask questions, to participate. The gated community, once defined by control, began to rediscover what it meant to be a community. And Marcus Hayes, the man they tried to intimidate into submission, became something far more powerful than a homeowner. He became a symbol of what happens when dignity meets injustice, and refuses to back down. Months after the verdict, the ripple effects of Marcus Hayes' stand continued to transform neighborhoods across the country. What had started as one man's resistance against a tyrannical HOA became a national reckoning with private power operating without public accountability. The gated communities that once symbolized security now faced scrutiny, and the name Marcus Hayes became a rallying cry for homeowners who had long suffered in silence. Local governments began reviewing their HOA registration policies. Several states passed legislation requiring oversight committees for HOA boards, with publicly available meeting minutes and caps on fines. Transparency that once seemed impossible was now law. Marcus's testimony had convinced legislators that power without checks invited corruption. He didn't just win a court case, he changed the conversation around suburban governance. Universities and law schools added his case to their curriculum under property rights and civil liberties. Legal scholars debated how much power communities should hold when governed by unelected boards. Some argued that Marcus's case was a modern-day civil rights victory, not because it happened in a courtroom, but because it reawakened the public to how racial bias and abuse could thrive behind polite facades and HOA charters. Veteran organizations created housing assistance programs to help service members navigate HOA regulations when returning to civilian life. Marcus became a key speaker at national conferences, often addressing rooms of veterans, housing advocates, and state lawmakers. In every speech, he reminded them that respect and service should not be stripped by zip codes or neighborhood policies. The standing ovations were never for his rank, but for his resilience. The neighborhood Marcus once called home no longer resembled the place where the conflict began. Cliff Maddox's removal created a vacuum, and for the first time in years, residents were allowed to vote freely without intimidation. A new board was elected, made up of diverse voices who prioritized communication, fairness, and unity. They reversed dozens of unfair fines, issued a public apology to Marcus, and established a new policy that no citation would be issued without photographic evidence and majority board approval. A community garden replaced the empty lot that once served as Cliff's private surveillance point. On the first day of spring, the board invited Marcus to plant the first tree, a gesture symbolizing healing and new beginnings. Children who once couldn't ride their bikes without HOA interference now played freely. Neighbors who once feared retaliation now hosted block parties, potlucks, and open forums. Marcus's ordeal didn't destroy the community, it helped rebuild it. News outlets followed up with "Where Are They Now?" features, chronicling the positive changes spurred by the case. Marcus never sought the spotlight, but he agreed to one final interview to mark the one-year anniversary of the verdict. He spoke about justice, but also about forgiveness. He said the fight wasn't just about one man's rights, it was about the soul of every neighborhood that forgot what it meant to care for one another. Behind the scenes, Marcus had begun mentoring young veterans entering law school, many of whom had been inspired by his battle. He sponsored scholarships and helped establish the Hayes Initiative for Housing Justice, a nonprofit organization that offered legal aid to families facing unjust HOA actions. His goal was to ensure no one else had to stand alone as he once had. The HOA Accountability Reform Act passed in 6 more states, each citing Marcus's case as the catalyst. Drone surveillance in residential neighborhoods without warrants was now illegal in over a dozen jurisdictions. Several corrupt board members in other neighborhoods resigned or were removed after residents cited the Hayes case as precedent to challenge their authority. The fear that once silenced homeowners was replaced with empowerment and knowledge. Marcus continued to live in the same house, not because he had to, but because he chose to. For him, staying was an act of reclamation. Every sunrise on that porch reminded him that dignity doesn't retreat, and every flag he raised stood not just for service in war, but for victory in peace. He remained a symbol of silent strength, not because he shouted louder than his enemies, but because he stood longer than their lies could survive. Children in the neighborhood often asked their parents why so many people smiled and waved at General Hayes. They were too young to understand courtrooms or bylaws, but they understood kindness. In time, they would learn that one man's quiet courage changed the rules for everyone. That's how legacies are built, not through monuments or medals, but through the simple decision to stand up when others would sit down. Long after the media moved on, the lessons endured. Across the country, fences still stood, but the people behind them no longer accepted isolation as the price of safety. They organized, voted, questioned, and redefined what it meant to live in a community. Marcus had shown them that no policy, no president, no board, could strip a person of their right to fairness. What began as a battle over a flag and a few citations ended as a defining moment in American civic life. And long after the gates closed behind him each night, Marcus Hayes rested not in quiet victory, but in the knowledge that his story had helped others reclaim their voice. And so, the story of Marcus Hayes isn't just about a retired general standing up to a corrupt HOA board. It's about what happens when silence is broken, when truth is louder than intimidation, and when one man's courage inspires a movement. Across the country, others are now finding their voice, thanks to one homeowner who refused to back down. Because dignity doesn't ask for permission. It stands its ground. If this story moved you, share it. Let others know they're not alone. Subscribe for more powerful real-life stories where truth fights back and wins. Until next time, stay strong, stay informed, and never let injustice go unanswered.